I'm Joseph Crickmore. I'm a PhD student here at Exeter, and I've been working with the research groups down here in Exeter on psychedelics for the last 2 years now. I'll speak a little more to that in a moment. Um, Moving on slightly. I think the opening would be something like, imagine a substance with the combined worldwide value of cocaine and petroleum, and you'll have some idea of the power of the spice melange. That's Herbert writing on the spice, trying to sort of get across how central this psychedelic substance is to his work, Dune. So in terms of why Dune, some of it is a very personal thing for me. I've been interested in the series throughout my whole life. But as I was introduced to the psychedelic space through some of the kind academics here, I was sat there listening to the secondhand trip reports of experiences of LSD and everything, and just thinking the whole time, it's the spice, like this is mirroring this very central fiction to me. But then, as a note of interest, I suppose you hear very euphemistically a lot of the time that Dune is a psychedelic work. Villeneuve speaks on that constantly when he's talking about his films. But nobody ever really expands or clarifies how or why. It's never really explored. And when you see lists of psychedelic fiction, Dune might be mentioned, but I'd argue not to the prominence it perhaps deserves with relation to its place in sci-fi and just how central the spice is to his work. So, in terms of what we're doing today, my aim is to sort of run two parallel tracks, introduce you to the world of Dune, and introduce Dune and the spice as a psychedelic work, while simultaneously introducing or like framing the spice through the decolonial or through the political philosophy of decolonization to sort of explore the commentary that Herbert offers on some of the challenges of decolonial theory and how they mirror some very important aspects of the philosophy that we study down here in Exeter. So to start, Frank Herbert. He was an author writing from the 40s up until his death in the 80s. Oh, I really can't read that. He was an author, a journalist, and a political aide through his life. In terms of personal motivations for him, he begins with an avid environmentalism and a sort of latent obsession with liberalism, which I'll get to, but also exploration with a lot of more esoteric things to him and to his mind, at least, such as his conversion to Buddhism later in his life. In terms of his motivations, why he started turning to journalism and then to fiction, his first inspiration or his first note of outrage was the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union. He sort of saw the suppression of fundamental freedoms as, something quite violating. And he was curious as to how, in his own words, people could be wrapped up in the myth-making fabric of society such that they could justify the surrendering of these freedoms. He was a registered Republican all of his life, and in fact had a very close relationship at a time with a family friend he nicknamed Cousin Joe, Joseph McCarthy. So unsurprisingly, it didn't take him long to become disillusioned with the United States of America. The blacklisting of suspected communists and the suppression of fundamental liberties to Americans start to transform the political questions that Herbert was asking. And again, in his own words, his question transformed from what it is about the fabric of society that creates a Hitler or a Mussolini to what it is that makes a Nixon, who he believes provided accidentally an invaluable lesson in not trusting power. Then the only other thing to add would be his work as a political aide, which, especially when we look at the framework of decolonization, is uniquely interesting. Daniel Immerwahr, commenting on Herbert's life, observes that in his work as a political aide traveling throughout some of the American colonial territories, he was operating within a colonial empire in the era of decolonization. And he himself commented that his experiences with the Quiloit tribe, which I pray I pronounced correctly, was fundamentally influential to his further works and concerns. So in terms of what themes he carries through, For Herbert, central is leadership, the concern of charismatic power, and what it is that makes a leader, how leaders come to define societies, but then also the relationship between religion, politics, and power, ecology and systems thinking, where he's credited by most commentators as the one of the first authors to deploy both themes in his works, which will be very important for this talk, human evolution and potentiality, and finally, the effects of mind-altering chemicals. So, in terms of his personal relationship to psychedelics, what one finds is actually, quite surprisingly, it's very hard to dig out. He was quite infamously coy about any personal engagement with the substances, and most of it ends up coming through secondhand sources. There's some speculation that some of his unwillingness to embrace these substances overtly is due to the era of prohibition he was writing in. But Paul Stamets, world-leading mycologist, and if he's not here, can somebody tell him that I said that, please? Comments in Mycelium Running that in his personal interactions with Herbert, that Herbert was finding novel ways to grow psilocybin mushrooms. He was, in fact, experimenting with techniques Stamets himself was unaware of, and that it was a latent obsession that ran through his life personally. But then, in terms of we want to map this literarily, right? The first clear marker we have for that is in the book The Santa Roga Barrier. It's one of his less well-known books, but it essentially explores how a community sustains itself, its cultural norms and practices, through the forced dissemination of a substance known as jaspers. It's nicknamed consciousness fuel by the residents of this community, and it's ingested either by food or drink. And Herbert overtly makes this a hallucinogenic substance in his work. In terms of exploring a drug aesthetic for the Santa Roga Barrier, we're in very, very similar territory to Huxley, to Soma, and to Brave New World. Dune is a little different. Much of it is very informed speculation. I would say aggressively informed speculation. But for example, Jodorowsky, the first director to try and translate Dune to film, has a quote that I wish I could read. There was something to the tune of one of his central goals when he was trying to create the film Dune was to translate the experience of taking LSD for the first time to the screen, which, blessedly, you are now witnessing some of the extracts from his failed film. In terms of a history of Dune, very briefly then, he's writing this, again, I believe from the 60s until his untimely death. It was originally planned to be a trilogy, but he expanded it to 6 works with a planned 7th before his untimely death. His son and I think a co-author have been trying to maintain the series since, to very limited success. It's credited, well, Herbert is credited as the Tolkien of sci-fi, probably not unjustifiably. As soon as you become familiar with Dune, and this was my experience, anyone who's exposed to any areas of sci-fi, be they Star Wars, I won't list them, they find very quickly that these science fiction authors or directors have been borrowing themes that Herbert created in Dune. And similarly, perhaps fittingly for the Tolkien of sci-fi, infamously, Dune has been credited as being impossible to adapt. So again, the first attempt was by Jodorowsky. It spawned a fascinating documentary called Jodorowsky's Dune that I'd very much recommend you watch. But then we have, otherwise, the 1984 film by David Lynch and the 2021 film, very recently, by Villeneuve. In terms of the 1984 film, if you're interested in an adaptation that really translates the ineffability and the mystical nature of the spice, you'll find a much more ready companion with Lynch's film. However, otherwise, in the words of Roger Ebert, in terms of evaluating the strengths of the Lynch film, he says, as long as you don't really think about it and you just let it wash around in your mind, it's good enough. Then, obviously, we have Villeneuve's adaptation in 2021, which seems to have met much more ready success. So that's it in terms of the history and the framing of Herbert, his relationship to psychedelia. My challenge now to sort of make a lot of the commentary on decolonization make sense is going to be to sort of familiarize any of you who don't know it with the world of Dune. So this is a big book. I've got like 30 minutes, so let's start at page 1, I guess. I'll try and do it myself. So The world of Dune is set, I think it's meant to be tens of thousands of years in the future. All of the known universe is under the domain of the Padishah Emperor of the known universe, a title of Ottoman origin, which is meant to reflect the very strange world of Dune, which has inherited objects and relics from the past that it can't quite account for, into this new colonial and totalizing apparatus. It is broken down into numerous institutions. For example, pictured there is meant to be the houses of the Landsraad, which is quite a neo-feudal organism, but then also state and colonial apparatus, which we will pause on very briefly, which I am going to have to turn around, I'm so sorry. So in terms of the first one, the navigators, what we'll find is that they deploy the spice. Any of you who've seen the Lynch film can see more clearly than in that image. They deploy the spice and they consume immense quantities of the spice to become these hideous sort of child worm figures in great vats. The idea being that they apprehend and seize the sort of time and space spending qualities of the spice to enable the logistical needs of the empire and travel across this great, across the universe. You have and they're obviously in the Spacing Guild. Then you have the Bene Gesserit, who rather opposite. They wield the mystical power of the spice to hone skills of physiology, or like physiological control and mystical control, to enable religious techniques of power to exert influence over the populations. These two institutions end up colouring much of how the spice is deployed in the world of Dune, which will be very, very important in a moment. But then otherwise, central to the world of Dune is the planet Arrakis. It is the only known planet on which the spice is produced. And indigenous to that planet are a population called the Fremen, completely outside the institutional apparatus of the Empire, who instead have a rich indigenous history of their own private use, and their own sort of mystical beliefs therein, completely set against the colonial empire that rules over them. Dune is meant to be, at its core, a critique of colonial power relations, but it's also an ecological work concerned with an interstellar Anthropocene, where you have planetologists who influence the very ecologies and environments of the planets they're in. Meanwhile, you have entire human populations conditioned, calling back again to Herbert's systems thinking, entire planetary populations conditioned by the environments and ecologies they inhabit, such as imperial warrior populations conditioned on harsh desert planets. Otherwise, and central to how we'll in a moment frame the spice, is that it is an empire immensely concerned with human augmentation and technology. One of the central creeds of the empire, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind," presents a challenge for the empire, as now any rich technological pursuits that we might typically imagine in a sci-fi space have to be achieved by the human mind. Therein, psychotropic substances are deployed in aid of creating individuals who can achieve these instrumental ends, who can achieve these objectives for the empire. So, we come out with the quote, "He who controls the spice controls the universe." It's a technology in Dune. It's one that has the power, it has very psychedelic, it occasions very psychedelic experiences, such as access to the ineffable, mystical experiences, the expansion of the human mind, to name a few, all to the view of creating invaluable human populations for the operation of the empire. As such, a rich political economy comes out around the spice itself. One of the quotes you'll hear quite a lot, "The spice must flow," demonstrates that within the world of Dune, the operation and economy that dictates the flow of the spice becomes a very central political challenge. But finally, there's also a note of profanity. The spice is established as a very sacred and mystical substance, and yet throughout, the engagement is immersed and perhaps perverted by human artifice and by human ends rather than an exploration of the mystical in and for itself. So in terms of how the spice is generated, it comes out of great sandworm eruptions in quite a sublime move from Herbert, but it's self-consciously a fungal excretion, and he sort of makes that clear himself. Paul Stamets, again, with a quote I will absolutely not read, asserts that Herbert himself, rather interestingly, was perhaps trying to explore the flow of a sort of fungal network through the human evolutions in Dune, but that Herbert himself was expressly trying to tie the spice and Dune to psychedelic substances. And the last point of like demonstration that this really is a psychedelic substance is the first-hand accounts we see from the works themselves. You have brusque soldiery types waxing poetic, like "My lungs taste the flow of time, whatever it is, blown past fallen sands," or Paul's first experience with the spice, which, hoping I've given you just about enough time to get the gist, does very much read like a trip report. So pausing now, that's the introduction done, right? So we just have to pause and look at how colonial power is coming to interact with the spice melange. The first thing I'd like to sort of observe is contrast this with Huxley. What we don't have now is a substance that is proliferated for the express control of a population. The drug itself does not aid in the control of the human populace. Instead, colonial power or power relations come to define how the substance is enabled to be used. The Fremen, for example, even in their rich mystical engagement with quite a sacred worship of the substance, find themselves bartering it with the Empire to allow themselves to exist without abuse and oppression on their own planet. So, how this relates more expressly to the sci-fi genre, Suzanne Ziega writes that 20th century sci-fi narratives are profuse with imperial metaphors of conquest, exploration, and ultimately colonial pursuits of power. Meanwhile, Higgins comments that Dune in particular is the pursuit of the colonial conquest over the human mind. 1 second. Yes. So what we can do is enmesh all that's come out of this observation with Dune and map it onto a particular approach to decolonial theory, advanced by one of the world's preeminent critical theorists, Hauskeller et al. What we have is an approach from a publication last year that asserts that it's colonial logics of power and persistent colonial thinking that has to be observed when we engage in a decolonial approach, and that very often pursuits to decolonize or to fight colonial powers and the persons that inhabit power in fact end up reifying or simply cyclically supporting those same oppressive dynamics. And now and so with that, we come to sort of the concluding remarks, simply to recap how things go and how it is that Herbert explores these tensions in Dune. So, in terms of a very brief one, Paul's journey is a very typical hero's journey, right? He is the archetypical gifted protagonist or a wonder kid, right? He is imbued with all of these mystical powers, imperial training, and he's the center of a religious prophecy of liberation from the Fremen. So any of you who have seen the first film know that he comes to great tragedy. His family are obliterated by the imperial apparatus, and he goes to seek refuge with the Fremen, who take him in as their soon-to-be Messiah. In terms of a speculation of where you might, if you're not familiar, see where the narrative goes in the second film from Villeneuve, it's a Lawrence of Arabia narrative, where Paul will surely explore further exploration with consumption of the spice, achieve great power over it and great mastery over nature and the Fremen, so that he can engage in a righteous war of liberation against colonial power and oppression, which would be great, but that's the end of the first book. There are plenty to follow. Ultimately, Dune is a critique of the hero's journey. One of Herbert's central concerns is how charismatic power and charismatic influences can come to pervert seemingly just causes out of an uncritical enthusiasm or an over-engagement with the pursuit of power relations rather than a critique thereof. in terms of some brief explorations of how that interacts, which I've got time to do pretty much all of it. The first is Liet-Kynes, a Fremen planetologist who seeks to colonize, who essentially seeks the colonial apprehension of Arrakis, terraforming it into a lush world for the sake of the benefit of the Fremen. Paul takes that quest on and ultimately comes to terraform Arrakis into a lush green world. In the Villeneuve film, he gives her a death that is very decolonial on the face of it. It is one where she wields the sublime power of nature against colonial oppressors to achieve a final victory. However, in the books, Herbert gives us something very different. Kynes is left to wander the desert alone, still in this rambling, lost state without hope of survival or supply, and wondering how it might be that humans can achieve mastery over nature, this typical colonial pursuit. Any of you familiar with the dialectic of enlightenment can see a very ready parallel with the Odyssean figure at the start of that. But Herbert writes about her death that she realized right in the moments before her death that the scientists and her father were all wrong, and that the only persistent principles of the universe were accident and error. Ultimately, the pursuit of colonial power over nature is futile for Herbert, and will only lead to the destruction of those therein. He grants nature a final victory over any colonial pursuit, and long after Paul's terraforming, we find that Arrakis does go back to become a desert planet, rich with the sandworms that had previously gone extinct. Then, finally, we have the interaction with indigeneity and decolonial power. Initially, the Fremen are very skeptical of Paul's pursuits. He's seizing this indigenous people, hoping to achieve his own personal quest for vengeance. However, wrapped in this sort of messianic narrative that they have, they quickly come to support his pursuits. How this ends is in the eradication of their culture. The planet has been terraformed. Their unique culture that had rose out of those conditions has been lost. And the only people who engage in typical Fremen culture now are museum Fremen, who exist only for the amusement and like the recreation of the citizens of the Empire. Meanwhile, the spice itself becomes lost to them, this central sacred substance to them, in an act of what we might observe as biopiracy. Has been apprehended by colonial logics in a very similar way to the peyote that we see today. Ultimately, Paul has led them on this great crusade for liberation, and has instead only achieved the deaths of millions while eradicating the very culture that he sought to free. I won't go into this part, this dour-looking figure, Max Weber, but this is very central to to Herbert. Weber was the most expressed political influence of Herbert. Herbert believes that you can frame much of the challenges of power relations through a Weberian analysis. He gave us descriptive categories to make sense of the forms of power that can be achieved. Traditional authority, rational legalistic authority, and charismatic power. All of these, Herbert believes, are fundamentally corruptible in some way, because it is not about the way that we legitimize power and the persons who inhabit it. It is about the underlying logics therein, which characters reflect on as they see Paul's sort of failure towards the end of his journey. They say that he's being destroyed by this very quest, and that ultimately his life's project has been a failure. So in his own pursuit to seize the colonial apparatus of the empire, he has simply gone to exert colonial influence in other directions and upon other victims without ever critically examining the structures that he is inhabiting. Ultimately, Paul's journey ends with him wandering into the desert, lamenting his fate, never to be seen again. So what's the point of all this, right? We'll turn back to the comments earlier about how we might want to examine the logic's fundamental, like underlying colonial pursuits themselves. Herbert's central appeal is one of critical engagement with these very logics. One should not see the decolonial pursuit as the assertion of power relations against power relations, but should question their approach and be sure that in so doing, they never reify fundamental categories that are ultimately colonial, such as property rights, but also that they don't ever boundary certain substances, like the spice, into instrumentalizing logics that condition their use, as we have seen through Paul's abuse of the spice, right? The analog to the real world would be in, say, the pursuit of the medicalization of psychedelics, which might come across as a very liberating and hopefully very progressive pursuit to the further proliferation of the substances, but might also end up being a gilded cage that only finds ways to justify psychedelia in a very specific domain, and it becomes even harder to grant arguments outside. In terms of the representative of the narrative for Herbert of this, it's Paul's son, Leto II. He is somebody who has been observing the sort of failures of his father. He's been lost in the consumption of spice and in trying to find the sort of where Paul failed. The fourth book, God Emperor of Dune, is rife with Nietzschean aphorisms and random pearls of wisdom from this man who's lost himself to the ineffable and also become a huge hulking worm. And he ultimately presents the thesis for Herbert and how we'll end. Leto's own words on all of these pursuits, which I'd like to just read, are most discipline is hidden, is hidden discipline, designed not to liberate, but to limit. You do not ask why, and be careful with how. Why leads you inevitably to paradox, and how to a universe of cause and effect, or instrumentalization, as we've seen. And he ends with both deny the infinite. The decolonial pursuit for Herbert should be one of openness. It should be one of critical reflection on the logics that we are using to mobilize our pursuits, and a ready openness to all the forms of knowledge that may come to us. He ends this very pretentiously with one of my favorite passages in Dune, where he says, as should be the central creed for any knowledge seekers in this space, that we will not try to predict the discoveries yet to be made within those pages. We say only that they must be made, for we are the fountain of surprises, the music came on, which he hopes is the sort of lesson that you take away from Dune. So those are some references to prove that I haven't made this all up, and there's some contact info at the end.